My name is Pat Paccassi. Official papers, you'll see it as Patricia Paccassi, but everybody calls me Pat. Yeah. The time frame we're dealing with for our being pioneers in Barbados is from 1971 to 1976.
Okay, that's perfect. Barbados is a beautiful island, and we just spent some time there with you and saw a lot of the friends and generally had just a wonderful week there. And now I'd like to ask you a few things about your experience there to kind of fill in a little of the spaces. Tell us, and again, if you could include the answer the question in the answer, I'd appreciate it. How did you come to settle in Barbados, Pat?
Well, our family had been pioneers in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. And this was the period of time when mass teaching first started in the United States. And when we got it down, heard about it, it was really exciting. So the National Assembly said, well, let's try it, okay? And so they asked me to coordinate the project. And we took the international team, a team of local Barbadians and regional Caribbean people to Barbados to conduct this teaching project. Well, after the project was over, it became very obvious with the 2,200 enrollments that the two pioneer families that were there were going to go start raving mad if they didn't have some help. And I always did like the Windward Islands, and felt a real sense of responsibility having coordinated the project. So Frank and I consulted. He quit his job, and we volunteered and moved down into Barbados.
All right, that's a very good reason to have moved to Barbados, to sort of tend to the baby that you had birthed in terms of the mass teaching project. I mean, it sounds to me like you had birthed this child that was the flood of new enrollments for the Baha'i faith, and now you were going to tend to this child and help it to grow.
Try.
Right, okay. So in terms of the fact that you were the mass teaching project coordinator, it was one thing to just blow in there and coordinate the project. If you wouldn't mind my asking you a question that isn't on this roster, which is sort of my way, maybe you could just give me just a tiny little description of what mass teaching looked like in Barbados. I mean, what was this project that you were doing?
Well, as I said, we had a large team comprised of people from different parts of the world, and including an auxiliary board member, Ruth Pringle, who represented the counselors. And we all lived together in what was then called a cane house. Now, this was the house that had housed the sugar workers that came from other parts of the island. So it had a lot of bunks, it had a big kitchen, it had a large dining room, it had a good central meeting room, and it was in the central part of the island. So what we would do is we would get together as a team, and we would consult about what we wanted to do, and we would take teaching material and go and walk in teams of 3 or 4 people up and down the streets, talking to people and asking them if they wanted to hear something about the Baha'i faith.
How many people were involved in doing this roaming around the villages?
Close to probably max 20 at one time, and maybe down to 15 with a core team.
Of this team, this 15 to 20 team, how many were youth?
Maybe half.
Half, okay. So about, let's say about 10 or 12 were youth, and the rest were adults. Okay. In terms of enrolling people in the faith, which it sounds like you were very successful at this, and how long would you say that the initial mass teaching went on, that it took to enroll 2,200 people? How long was that?
Well, that entire period lasted 6 months, but the first project that we had intended was 21 days, okay? Because this is most teaching projects in this area in the beginning were for 21 days because we could get cheaper airfares, okay? And then a smaller team would stay after that. And then by Jim Taylor and Ruth Pringle and myself, back and forth, stayed on and did some real follow-up afterwards. So 6 months in all it took for the 2,200.
Okay, and you wouldn't call, that was just the initial project itself?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of follow-up and the effort to maintain the initial success of 2,200 enrollments, Would you like to talk for just a minute or two about follow-up on that?
Yeah.
What it took?
Yeah, it took an enormous amount of effort. It took a whole bunch of energy, and it took a lot of planning.
For what? Because I want to cut my voice out.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And it took a lot of planning for this mass teaching project follow-up. Ruth Pringle had composed a follow-up plan, which Ian Semple, who's in the House of Justice, said in the Holy Land to me personally, it was a brilliant plan. But the whole plan was dependent upon meeting. And what we had anticipated was that the government schools would give permission to have our meetings inside the schools, and they did not. Now, we don't know what influences were at work, but whatever. So at this point, the follow-up for the project became really difficult, because we would have to try to go out, this small band of people would have to try to go out and visit the different communities. We would try to find meeting places. And the Barbadian really didn't like to bring strangers into his home. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't something where you could, say, well, can we have a meeting in your house type of thing.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. The fact of the matter is, when you first went out and did this mass teaching project, you had quite a few young people with you.
Right.
And they were very willing, and they had energy to go out and talk to people and enroll people and like that. Mm-hmm. But later on, how were the youth in terms of follow-up and to the adults? Like, were you having to encourage the youth to go on with this, and they were, willing, or how was that?
Well, again, you're dealing with a very small number of people, and the youth were very willing, but youth always required a large support group, and things that happen behind them. You have to, give them the car, you have to buy the gas, you have to see that the teaching material is there for them. You have to do the planning to see that the thing, that the proper areas are gone to. You have to see that the membership lists are there. Somebody always has to remember to bring sandwiches for the kids. I mean, it's just a real big support group, but they had the energy to do it.
Right. So you needed to do this follow-up, and you had decided to stay in Barbados, right?
Yes, our family had moved.
Your family had actually moved to stay in Barbados.
Yes.
And for how long were you involved in what you follow up to the mass teaching project?
The day we left.
From the day you left?
Yeah, because as well as the youth, which were doing things in groups, we also had our own territories. Frank had his own territory he had to cover. I had a territory. Frank Fernandez had a territory. Phil and Karen Woods each covered theirs. So we were just, we would go to the places, we'd walk around, and of course the guys had full-time jobs. And Karen was working all the time. We were all raising families. I had an elderly grandmother who lived with me. Life goes on as well as what you try to do. So every weekend we would go to wherever our territory was. But it just, as much as you do, it's just never enough.
It was an overwhelming task.
Yeah, it's just never enough.